So with blue hydrogen, you end up with hydrogen that has low emissions, but you've got CO2 that you have to figure out how to sequester. With green hydrogen, you've got to source a lot of renewable electricity at very high capacity factor. And so Turquoise would be the combination of those two, where you have the best of both worlds. You have very low electrical energy consumption, and you also don't have CO2 to go sequester and deal with.
Hey folks, I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. Here's an interesting question. If we wanted to send a message out to any possible intelligent extraterrestrial life, how would we format that message so that it could be understood without the need to share concepts like language or Earth-based images? There's not necessarily a right answer, but if you want to know what some of the brightest scientific minds on Earth thought would be the best bet to actually try, the key to the whole thing is the hydrogen atom. That's part of the method that Carl Sagan and Frank Drake devised for the Pioneer plaque, a picture message affixed to the first human-built objects to be launched beyond our solar system, the Pioneer 10 and 11 space probes, in case they were to be found by intelligent life. You can take a look at what this message looks like online. The whole thing is very neat. But the important part is the top left corner. It's a schematic meant to establish some common understandings like units of measurement, duration, and a direction of time by diagramming a particular process that hydrogen atoms undergo. How it does this is pretty clever, but also kind of complicated. What's relevant is that when tasked with coming up with something so fundamental that any form of intelligent life could not possibly fail to recognize what it was supposed to be, Sagan and Drake chose the structure of hydrogen. And that is what's at the center of our conversation today. Hydrogen. In fact, hydrogen is kind of at the center of just about everything that exists. It is number one on the periodic table for a good reason. It was the first element to be formed in the universe. It accounts for 75% of all known matter. It is a substance from which stars are made, and it is the fusion of hydrogen atoms into helium in a star's core that produces the light and energy that ultimately sustains all life on this planet. It's also the further fusion of hydrogen and helium in more massive stars that produces the most naturally occurring elements. If the star is large enough and hot enough, hydrogen fuses into helium, and helium fuses into carbon, and on and on and on until it reaches iron. Then the fuel runs out, the star collapses on itself, and then explodes as a supernova, scattering all those elements out into the universe to seed more stars and wind up on planets like ours. Some of those scattered carbon atoms, given the right conditions, can combine to produce complex molecules that contain instructions on how to replicate themselves, aka DNA. And given enough time, evolutionary pressure, and just the right amount of caffeine, that DNA eventually evolves to produce podcasters, among other various important things. We are indeed, as Carl Sagan said, made of star stuff, and that stuff is ultimately just different combinations of hydrogen, which is all what makes hydrogen so attractive as an energy source for the future. If you're looking for a sustainable fuel, it's hard to do better than the most abundant substance in the universe. Unfortunately, we're quite a ways off yet from being able to reproduce the nuclear fusion of hydrogen that occurs in stars in any way that would give us a net gain of energy. Unsurprisingly, it's really hard to produce the temperature of the sun without using a massive amount of energy input. But there's still a ton of important sustainability uses for hydrogen, either as a potential clean fuel in its own right, or as a component of other alternative fuels like ammonia. We've even talked about some of those already on the show, like our conversation with Dr. Sung-Hoon Woo of ammonia fuel producer Amogy. But if you've been reading ahead or just have a keen sense for these kinds of things, you may have guessed correctly that there's another complicating wrinkle, because of course there is. See, the ability to combine into other things is part of what makes hydrogen so important. But it also means that, on Earth anyway, pure hydrogen gas, like what's needed for alternative fuel production, is pretty hard to find. Most of the hydrogen on Earth's surface is locked up in chemical compounds, sometimes in hydrocarbons like methane, but most abundantly in molecules like dihydrogen monoxide. You may be familiar with that one. We sometimes refer to it as water. Now, the good part is that it's no sweat to break either of those compounds back down into pure hydrogen. We've known how to do that for a while now. The tricky part is that while the hydrogen itself is a super clean fuel source, the processes we currently have for getting that hydrogen are not particularly sustainable. As you heard in today's Cold Open, the current method for extracting hydrogen from hydrocarbons like natural gas, what people call blue hydrogen, actively produces CO2 as a byproduct. That's pretty counterproductive when the hydrogen economy is largely aimed at decarbonizing high-emissions industries like heavy transportation, energy, and agriculture. But what if someone devised a process for extracting hydrogen from natural gas that didn't produce CO2, but instead resulted in a solid carbon byproduct that was much easier to transport and sequester efficiently? That incredibly innovative process for simultaneously decarbonizing natural gas and supplying needs of a future hydrogen economy is the secret sauce behind game-changing hard tech startup C0. And I'm very excited to be joined for today's conversation by their co-founder and CEO, Zach Jones. Zach's had a fascinating career on all sides of the innovation economy. As a biomedical engineer, a multi-time founder, and as a venture capital investor before his lifelong passion for the hydrogen space led him to stumble on the research that would eventually become the seed of C0. From hydrogen hubs to the hydrogen rainbow and hydrogen 3.0 and beyond, I had a blast chatting with Zach about everyone's number one element. Okay, sorry, I couldn't resist that one. It was just too easy. Let's dive into the conversation. So before we get into the business, which I'm super excited to talk about, I do want to start just with your background and hear a little bit about where you're from and growing up. So let's start with hometown.
You bet. From Half Moon Bay, California, which is a little town about 30 miles south of San Francisco, and actually grew up on a ranch. So a lot of hands-on problem solving. Water and getting our water system online was always a perpetual challenge. So I spent all my weekends with my dad trying to make sure that we had water supply for the house and also for the animals. And it was a good exercise in engineering and thinking ahead, because I was always responsible for putting the tools that we would need in the truck. And if we wound up needing a tool that we didn't have, I was going to have to walk all the way back to the barn to go get it. So a lot of hands-on thinking ahead from an early age.
It sounds like that became a precursor to your interest in engineering, but also, chemistry. And I feel like you mentioned before that you were interested in hydrogen, like even all the way back to middle school. So I'm curious, what grabbed your attention about chemistry and kind of where that passion was born?
Yeah. So I come from a line of engineers, and more specifically chemical engineers. So I was given a chemistry set at a very early age, but I'll never forget doing the quintessential, high school, middle school chemistry experiment where you electrolyze water, collect the hydrogen that comes off in a test tube and combust it. And I think I was at an impressionable age, maybe even a little bit of a pyromaniac. And so I just never forgot, wow, we just made something explode by using a battery and water. That's really cool. And so it's always been, something that's interesting to me has been the hydrogen economy and kind of keeping a track of what the status was as I went through undergrad and subsequently business school.
So when you go to undergrad, and you went to Duke for biomedical engineering, I think, right?
Correct.
Did you know where you were going to take that, or was it just kind of a field that you were passionate about and you were going to explore it as you went?
Well, I knew that I wanted to do something that was in the biomedical field, and looked at a bunch of different schools and was really thinking during all the tours, please God, just let me get into one of these schools, and hadn't paid a lot of attention to the nuances between them. And so wound up having a great visit at Duke and ultimately chose to go there. And the curriculum was really, I would say it was mostly electrical engineering, which was still very interesting. And then there's some, chemistry and biology and a little bit of mechanical, but a great overall engineering degree to teach you the fundamentals across all those different fields. So wound up being a really great experience.
Was there a point at which you kind of began to see a future, or were you kind of, as you worked your way through school, seeing the next step, or how did you kind of grow through your undergrad?
Yeah, I always wanted to be an engineer. And so it was and still is, I think, considered the most difficult major at Duke. And so it attracted a lot of other people who wanted to go be management consultants or wanted to go work on Wall Street, but wanted to go do the hardest thing. I was not the greatest student when it came to, let's see who can, memorize the test and go do all the rote chalkboard regurgitation and math. But when it came time to the actual design classes, I think I got A+ in everything that actually required designing a piece of equipment and building something. For example, one challenge that we were given was figure out how to make an oxygen sensor for price-sensitive emerging markets with a cost of goods of less than $100. And so I came up with a way to use a zinc air hearing aid battery and measure the impedance of that, and then go build a calibration table and go correlate that to how much oxygen is in the atmosphere, which would be used to basically help diagnose neonatal intensive care units and make sure that the oxygen concentrators were functioning properly. And there's actually a nonprofit that built several thousand of those devices and sent them out to emerging markets. So it was really, when it got time to actually build things, that I feel like I really excelled, and definitely never even considered going into finance until later in business school.
Right. So when did the entrepreneurial bug hit? Like, when was that or that decision to go to business school even? I guess we'll start there. Like, what was the pivot that led you to business school?
So I had actually started a medical device company out of undergrad, effectively, based on some of the coursework and some of the design projects, continued that thinking to develop a medical device that was, an order of magnitude lower cost, both in CapEx and also in OpEx, than what's available in the United States, and got some traction with that, and ultimately got it sold, but didn't really make any money. And I decided that business school was a good way to get out of medical devices. So that's kind of what led me there.
Did you love it, business school?
I did, actually. I hadn't expected to, but it was a fantastic experience, and still very close with a lot of my classmates, and really was an opportunity to build my network in the Bay Area. Having gone to Half Moon Bay High School and then gone east for college, didn't really have friends who were starting companies, raising capital, et cetera, in the Bay Area. So it was fantastic.
I'm curious, thinking about even coming out of undergrad and starting a company, how did you have in my case, I don't think I had the guts to do it, but where did you find kind of that fortitude to jump into the deep end, in a real challenging, complex sector straight out of undergrad? Like, was entrepreneurship something you were always really passionate about, or was it kind of this startup just came out of a particular passion about a product or idea that you had, or how did that kind of evolve?
Yeah, always something I've been very passionate about. I've always had I don't know if I want to say a side hustle necessarily, but always some way of making money. I used to sell pumpkins on the side of the road as a little kid in Half Moon Bay. Did a robust, trading business in the early days of eBay. So I've always sort of envisioned working for myself and not working for a big company. I did some interviews and got a job offer or two out of undergrad, but it was always going to be, I want to cook up an idea, scale it up, and try to take it through founding my own company and taking that and making that a reality.
Yeah. It's probably wouldn't surprise you to hear we've talked to a ton of Stanford grads on the podcast. And one question I always ask folks is what you think it might be about Stanford in particular that seems to produce so many founders and leaders in the climate tech space, whether they're from the business school, the engineering school. Like, we've had a ton from a variety of different disciplines. And I'm curious if there's a secret ingredient that instills or develops leaders at such a seemingly higher rate than other places.
I think there's a self-selection into Stanford where if you're predisposed to that, then that becomes your number one choice, either for undergrad or for business school. Certainly on the Graduate School of Business, there's a number of different courses that are geared towards entrepreneurship, which were, very valuable. Almost all, in my view, kind of soft skills, case study of, here's a hypothetical of a situation that's probably going to happen to you someday. How are you going to manage that? And so I think that it's probably just students who are entrepreneurial or think they might be self-select into that, which sort of drives more coursework in that area, solving real world situations. And, I think actually the most outrageous thing you could have done coming out of my business school class was just to go work for a big company. That would have been seen as much more off the beaten path than trying to start something.
Right.
I think still the thing that is not in the brochures is most of those are still unsuccessful. Lots and lots of classmates that have tried to start something and didn't work as well as they thought it would. So, I don't know that the success rate is any higher, but I think a lot of folks at least go there and give it a shot.
Yeah. So from business school to C0, kind of talk to us about how that time evolved. What were the important steps between, finishing off grad school and then we can jump in next and hear about the origin story of C0. But give us a bit of the bridge between the two.
Yeah. So I had done some consulting projects for a small private equity firm, just as a way to kind of get to know you type of matchmaking while I was at business school. And then ultimately found my way there after a year or so of working for another startup in the Bay Area and was quite happy. It was, interesting for me doing finance and really having had an engineering degree coming into business school, but being able to, do enough modeling. I mean, if you can do differential equations and all the math that's involved in biomedical engineering, the arithmetic involved in setting up a discounted cash flow is trivial. So it wasn't that it was, particularly challenging, but it was interesting to have exposure to a couple of different businesses and think through, how those operations worked. And after I had built up a little bit of, positive reputation, I actually pitched them on, hey, if I find something in the hydrogen space that makes sense, would we consider investing? And the answer was, yeah, sure. I don't know anything about that. Don't know anything about energy, but let us know. And so that was kind of a great platform to go start looking into the hydrogen space circa 2015, 2016, 2017. And, working for an entity capable of writing a check, always got your phone calls returned
Yeah,
from anybody.
the door's open.
And so I looked at all of the business models that were available then. Electrolysis business models, electrolyzer manufacturers, fueling stations for vehicles. Actually went out and hired an engineering firm to do an analysis of pre-plumbing a 4 square mile distribution center that was being built in Northern California, pre-plumbing that with high-pressure hydrogen lines, which would have been a world's first to treat hydrogen like a utility and just have it built in. And the idea behind that work was that at that time, one of the few opportunities to use hydrogen as a fuel was in forklifts, and that each of the dozen or so buildings at this distribution center would be almost certainly doing significant amounts of material handling. And so if you could have high pressure hydrogen available to go fuel forklifts, you'd be able to get great economies of scale on the hydrogen production and distribution, because all of those buildings would link back to a central location. And that would be something that the landlord might potentially be interested in subsidizing, because that would get them tenants. And so looked at some things like that, but ultimately could never get the ROI to pencil out. And if you take that specific investment, what do you need to go right? Well, the landlord has to get the type of tenant that's doing the type of material handling that can benefit from hydrogen. And then the hydrogen fuel cell provider needs to go acquire them as a customer to go retrofit the forklifts to run on hydrogen. And then somebody has to actually get the hydrogen from a local industrial gas supplier until you have sufficient critical mass to put down your own on-site hydrogen generation. So you look at that and you're like, I need all these things to go right that are totally beyond my control. And my reward for that is making 15% of my money. The ROI just was never really there, but it was certainly a great opportunity to go explore and get familiar with the space and understand the ecosystem.
So then when was the moment where you saw the potential for C0, like that, the actual aha moment or the origin story that helped kick off C0?
Yeah. So I had all those experiences and had never found anything that had the right ROI, but it had become clear to me that if there ever is an expanded role for hydrogen beyond just using it for petrochemical applications, or even just decarbonizing those applications, that the good part of the hydrogen ecosystem is going to be making the molecules. And at the end of 2017, I read a paper in Science by Dr. Eric McFarland, who's my co-founder, on some of the work that he had done to crack natural gas into hydrogen and solid carbon. And so the aha moment, at least for me, was reading that paper and saying, this is really interesting because it gives you the opportunity to make molecules that are both low cost because they come from natural gas and also low carbon because you're removing the carbon that's in the natural gas as a solid. And so he was based in Santa Barbara, where he's a professor at UC Santa Barbara. And I flew down there a couple of times at the beginning of 2018, looking to invest. And it became very clear that despite his track record in scaling up his own research in the 2000s, he took a gas to liquids technology from his lab to building a $50 million pilot. In the 2010s, he built a 50,000 ton per year ethyl acetate plant that was based on his research. And so it's clear that, despite his background, there was no entity to write a check to, and certainly not a check at the technical risk stage that I had been looking for, which was really
Sure.
more of let's not take any technology risk and let's go deploy hydrogen with off-the-shelf equipment. But Eric's a terrific salesman, and so after a couple trips down there, I finally said, there's nothing to write a check to here, Eric. This is cool research, but we can't invest in this. And he said, well, you know more about hydrogen than any half engineer, half finance guy I've ever met before. Why don't you leave and we'll go start a company to go scale this up? And so that was really how it started, was me cold calling him after reading his paper in Science.
How hard of a sale was that for you to take the leap and become a co-founder?
Not that hard, to be honest, just because by that point in time, I had understood sort of the finance side of things a little bit more and come to the conclusion that, I could probably always get back into this if I wanted to. And, I'm an engineer at heart and kind of geek out of the technology. And Eric's been through it multiple times before, as have I. And so I thought, let's give this a shot, because also there's nothing else in hydrogen that's happening right now that's really of interest to me too. So it was really the only way to kind of play the hydrogen thesis, which has always been appealing to me. So I couldn't pass up the shot to go do a startup again, and specifically a startup that was in an area that's always been so, interesting to me.
Yeah. As you think about, I guess, in GSB parlance, what the TAM of this opportunity could be, like, how would you quantify that for folks that aren't familiar with these spaces? Like, how should our listeners understand the commercial potential, the scalability potential of what this could grow into?
Yeah, it violates most of the rubrics or metrics that they would teach you at the GSB in terms of what a good startup should be. It's low margin, it's capital intensive. You've got to move around a lot of solids if you're successful, which is something you never want to do in chemical engineering. You always avoid making solids if you can. But the market size is gigantic, because in a world that cares about carbon emissions, this is, one of the few ways to decarbonize natural gas, which is a third of the world's energy. And so that is an extraordinary number, all predicated, of course, upon there being a willingness to pay a premium to avoid putting CO2 in the atmosphere. I think that's the challenging part of this, is believing that that is going to be the future that we live in. But if it is, as a bet, it pays, 1,000 to 1, orders of magnitude to 1.
Right.
If you're a company that can go remove the carbon from natural gas at scale, do it without needing to co-source renewable electrons, basically say, anywhere that I've got natural gas, I can give you most of the energy out of that in the form of hydrogen, is an incredibly valuable place to find yourself if you're successful.
So how would you then just simplify for folks the elevator pitch today? What C0 does, who the clients are, and how you do it?
Sure. So we've got a pilot plant in Texas that is being commissioned right now, should be running by the end of next month. And basically, we take natural gas and we combine that with a low-cost disposable catalyst and oxygen from the air. And our outputs are hydrogen and solid carbon and a little bit of byproduct water. And really, what we talk about our technology is doing is not making hydrogen. Yes, that's what we do. But we think about it as really decarbonizing natural gas. And if you look at where the energy comes from in natural gas, which is a hydrocarbon made out of, hydrogen and carbon atoms, about 60% of the energy actually comes from the hydrogen atoms. So our pitch to entities involved throughout the natural gas value chain is, you're already the largest zero-emission energy / hydrogen producers, distributors, consumers in the world. You just need to figure out how to separate out that carbon before it gets turned into CO2. And so that's kind of the state of the technology right now. We've completed engineering studies with our engineering firm at both what we view as the first commercial scale system, which would be, something around 6 tons of hydrogen a day. And simultaneously, we've done that at also the first world scale system, which would be 270 tons of hydrogen per day. And really anywhere in between those two different ranges, we should be able to go build a single process train for producing hydrogen from natural gas, for decarbonizing natural gas. And that technology would be located in between the existing natural gas infrastructure and either an existing hydrogen consumer today or an existing natural gas consumer. So you put it in front of a combined cycle power plant, and rather than have to go capture CO2 on the back end, which is very expensive, we pull the carbon out ahead of time and give that power plant hydrogen to go run on. Or it could be displacing steam methane reforming at a petrochemical complex, which is how almost all the hydrogen in the world is made today. But it makes a tremendous amount of CO2, over 10 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And so you really want to go make hydrogen on site and consume it where you're going to use it. And part of our value proposition is that rather than have to go move hydrogen around or figure out how to go move electrons around to go split water into hydrogen and oxygen, we use the existing natural gas infrastructure, which is, almost ubiquitous.
Right. You guys talk about turquoise hydrogen. And, for those of us that are still getting familiar with green hydrogen, what is turquoise hydrogen and how is it kind of different or better or more sustainable as a process to others?
Sure. Well, with a caveat that I think everyone is getting a little fatigued with the hydrogen rainbow, which is expanded to, I'm not even sure that I could name all the colors in the rainbow at this point. And I think there's folks are thinking more about it in terms of, hey, just give me the hydrogen. Tell me what the carbon intensity is, which is a perfectly fine way to think about it. There's green hydrogen, which is made by using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And there's also blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen made by reforming of natural gas, which is different than our process because reforming produces a lot of CO2. And blue hydrogen is that reforming step plus carbon capture. So with blue hydrogen, you end up with hydrogen that has low emissions, but you've got CO2 that you have to go move around in a pipeline and figure out how to sequester, which is very difficult and expensive to do. With green hydrogen, you've got to source a lot of renewable electricity at very high capacity factor. And so turquoise would be the combination of those two, green and blue, overlapping to make turquoise, where you have the best of both worlds. You have very low electrical energy consumption, which is something that we've designed our process technology based around avoiding electrical energy consumption. And you also don't have CO2 to go sequester and deal with. And so part of the thesis when Eric and I started the company was that this belief that, well, electricity is going to basically be so cheap from renewables that you can afford to use very large quantities of it to go split water via electrolysis and make green hydrogen, that those electrons were going to take a lot longer to materialize than most people thought. And I think that's turned out to be the case. And now when you talk to utilities, the conversation is really around, are we going to have enough electricity to do everything that we need to do today, running AI data centers, recharging electric vehicles, let alone enough to have surpluses that are available to go split water during sort of off-peak times. So I think we've been correct in that thesis that electricity is going to remain relatively expensive. And that's had a lot of folks in the industry in the hydrogen space thinking about, okay, well, we'll do blue hydrogen. And now everybody's kind of getting down into the details of sequestering the CO2 that comes along with that. And there's this kind of common belief in the marketplace that, well, we know how to sequester CO2. We've been doing that, for decades. And that's true, but that's almost entirely been for enhanced oil recovery. So pumping CO2 underground to go boost oil production, pumping CO2 underground to bury it so it doesn't go into the atmosphere is still kind of uncharted territory. There's only a handful of projects out there that have done it. They don't have a great operational track record. And even if that were a solved problem everywhere, just transporting CO2 is really tough. You got to go build pipelines. They have to be relatively large in order to carry enough CO2 to justify the permitting process that goes through them. You've seen some of the marquee ones get canceled across the Midwest. So we kind of think that that's going to be the next shoe to drop, is that sequestering CO2 is going to turn out to be a lot more difficult than folks are anticipating.
Yeah. And this solves for those.
Yes, correct. And so, what we transport instead would be solid carbon.
Right.
And an interesting way to think about our technology is that we turn the existing solids handling infrastructure into CO2 equivalent transportation infrastructure. So rather than have to go build, thousands of miles of CO2 transportation pipelines, fight those eminent domain battles, we'll pull out the carbon as a solid and move it around with rail cars or barges if you're near a waterway. And basically, if you look at what our technology does in its CO2 equivalent transportation level on a rail line, we make any rail line equivalent to an order of magnitude more CO2 transportation potential than the biggest CO2 pipeline that's been built in North America. So the ability of just the existing rail infrastructure to go transport CO2 equivalent is massive, and it already exists today, and you don't have to go fight permitting battles.
Right. You had this funny line when we spoke first that this might be the era of hydrogen 3.0, and I think you gave it the tagline, "It's for real this time," which I love. So I was curious, for you to kind of explain that concept to folks. Hydrogen's obviously been around for a while, but never quite reached that full scale, full potential that it may have had, or folks have hoped it might get to. And I'm curious, what's convinced you that this time around, this is the right era for hydrogen, and why is it real this time?
Well, I think it's 3.0 within my lifetime. If you talk to the folks who've been industrial gas their entire careers, they might tell you we're on 17.0
right.
in terms of successive waves. But I say this is 3.0 because there was a wave kind of in the 2000s. There was another wave during the Bush administration. And then hydrogen had such a bad reputation that when we were initially pitching C0, we didn't mention hydrogen until slide 12 because we didn't want to be viewed as, oh, here's another, perpetual technology of the future. Here's another crazy hydrogen idea. But I think what is giving it legs this time, and if hydrogen's ever going to play a role beyond just a petrochemical input, it's that you've got palpable climate change as a forcing function to drive that, hey, we got to do something different. And, I joked before about this is not a great business by most Stanford Graduate School of Business standards because it's low margin and capital intensive. But I will say the problem that it's addressing is not going away. You're going to see records set every year, probably for all of our lifetimes, even if we stop making CO2 today, of climate change getting hotter, of all the other negative effects associated with that. And so I think that being front and center gives it a real shot of having this be the time that hydrogen catches on. You've got the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in 2022, which provides, a significant subsidy for making hydrogen that has lower carbon intensity than how it's made today. So you've got awareness, you've got a forcing function for change, you've got a subsidization scheme, at least in the United States. And so I think if all of those factors converging together don't make hydrogen 3.0 the one that works, then I don't know. I don't think there's a 4.0 or I don't know what that world looks like. But if it's ever going to work, I think this is the time.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the IRA. I'm curious, along with that came the hydrogen hub discussion, and we've got a couple that are now in development. Curious kind of what your take is on the hydrogen hubs as public-private partnership work and how you think those will evolve. Are you excited to see that process? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of misalignment between the IRA and the hubs because with some of the guidance that has been issued by Treasury on how the IRA would be implemented, there are projects at hubs that couldn't qualify for it.
Yeah.
And so there's some details that need to be straightened out. I think the public-private partnership nature of the hubs is fantastic. And we're starting to see those actually get awarded now, which is very exciting. We've got relationships with hubs and some conversations that are ongoing. I will say they're mostly based around existing technologies that are, TRL9. That's something that we kind of joke about in the company is that everybody wants new, innovative projects to go fund, but they have to be TRL9, which by definition means that you can't really have, new technology that is at that level. So I think there are new technologies like ours and some other startup companies that are going to start to go work their way up that scale with pilots and first-of-a-kind demonstrations. And I think that timing has a chance of overlapping with the time horizon of the hubs. But at the very least, the hubs are bringing hydrogen to everyone's attention. And there will be very large capital-intensive projects that are, making hydrogen that has a lower carbon intensity than how it's made today via steam methane reforming. So I think it's positive.
You talked about not even using hydrogen until page 12 of the pitch deck. And you have, a great roster on your cap table, Breakthrough, SK, name a few. I'm curious what the fundraising process was like in general for this. Like, how'd you convince investors of the viability of this, and how were they receiving this new approach in the marketplace?
So the first investor that we brought in was really Breakthrough. And Breakthrough had spent some time with our CTO in having him talk to Bill Gates about hydrogen and getting Bill excited about hydrogen.
That's cool.
We had a funny moment in the company where Bill was being interviewed on 60 Minutes and pulled out a binder full of papers. And so he pulls out the binder full of hydrogen papers. And I was watching it on my phone, so I didn't have high enough resolution. But I said in our company chat, case of beer for whoever has 4K access to 60 Minutes and can see what paper that is. And sure enough, it was one of Eric's papers that Bill had flipped through on 60 Minutes, which was exciting for us. So Eric had gotten the ear of Breakthrough, and it was really up to me to convince them that we could do this technically, that there was a pathway to scale it up, and to go bring in the rest of the investor syndicate. And so everybody in the cap table has a slightly different kind of view on how the world might unfold or what the use cases for the technology would be. And I think that's been really, really positive, because we've got a great list of strategic investors that we can go talk to and chat with them about how they would use the technology, which is very different. So, SK is focused on Asia as a broader region, is kind of down to two potential vectors for how they would decarbonize. It's either make ammonia somewhere with some decarbonized source of hydrogen and ship that green ammonia to Asia, crack it back into hydrogen, or burn it directly in a coal plant and get your decarb that way, or continue moving LNG around as they do today and crack it into hydrogen and solid carbon at the point of use in the country. And in either of those scenarios, our technology, I think, has a critical role to play. Obviously, if you're going to do the cracking of natural gas into hydrogen and solid carbon in country, you can locate one of our facilities there. And we've got a project moving forward with one of our investors in that area. But also, if you want to make sort of green ammonia, you've got to locate your ammonia plants someplace where there is just the perfect capacity factor of renewable energy. The perfect scenario where wind and solar are out of phase with each other to get the capacity factor up and the cost down, to get your green electrons, to go make green hydrogen, to make your green ammonia, or use our technology and put it somewhere in the Gulf Coast where natural gas is, a little over $2 a million BTU today. It's very cheap. At $2 a million BTU, a kilogram of hydrogen atoms in the natural gas costs 40 cents. Which is unbelievably cheap. And we have some inefficiencies in the process, so we're not quite there. And you got to pay for the CapEx, but we can be, well under $2 a kilogram hydrogen, levelized cost of hydrogen at that price. And so locating our technology at the very beginning of the supply chain rather than the end is also a great option. And so, SK and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries have been great to work with and get their feedback on that area. We spend a lot of time with Trafigura, that's also an investor, one of the biggest physical commodities traders in the world, and, chat with them about what they're seeing. And so there's obviously lots of different things to trade in a world where our technology is being used to decarbonize a significant fraction. There's solid carbon that needs to be moved around. Trafigura's got a history of trading petcoke and also bitumen, which are kind of low-value solids that have a carbon backbone to them. Hydrogen may be something that's traded. Ammonia is already traded today, but green ammonia is probably something that will be traded as well. So it's been really helpful as we try to think about solving this challenge at a scale that is meaningful to climate change, where we can actually build world scale plants. And if this is going to be a significant decarb vector, you're going to need hundreds of them to talk with, the scale of entities who are involved in the businesses that would actually benefit from, fleets of world scale plants being deployed.
Have you noticed anything in particular that you find unique or interesting of how the Asian market's thinking about this versus the domestic U.S. market, out of curiosity?
I think there are fewer substitutes in those markets.
Gotcha.
And so I think that has maybe yielded a little bit more focus. And I think that that's positive for us. The challenge is that, we're very sensitive to the price of natural gas. And so by the time
Right.
that you've got sort of LNG that's been regasified in Asia, you're talking, $6 to $7, $8 a million BTU. But everything's expensive. Building out a new supply chain for green ammonia is expensive. People talk about, well, the supply chain for ammonia already exists, but it exists for agriculture. So there's a one-to-one cannibalization of,
Right.
every piece of existing ammonia infrastructure that you repurpose for energy is coming directly out of the ag side of things. Somebody's not getting that ammonia that they were going to use for agricultural purposes. So, I think there are fewer options, which leads to a sort of more focus and more intense interest as a result.
Interesting. You've talked a lot about being a bridge from the legacy natural gas asset and reserve into the low carbon future. And I think it's a really interesting conversation. We've had quite a few folks who have been quick to embrace themselves as part of the bridging technology movement. BJ Johnson from Clear Flame had a great phrase that being a bridge doesn't mean you're a bridge to nowhere, which I thought was just a smart way to put a pin on that for folks. But I'd love to give your perspective on being part of this bridge technology construct and the importance of solutions that are aimed at, minimizing loss in the clean energy transition immediately, as a way of helping move towards a longer term time horizon.
Well, I don't know that I would see it as a bridge necessarily, because bridge means that we're moving into a world that doesn't use natural gas.
Sure.
And, I think that world is 100 years away. Because what you see right now is, well, we need more electricity to go run things that require a very high capacity factor, like data centers. You got to do that with the infrastructure and technology that you have today. And, the new technologies, geothermal has had some good sort of projects, and there's good support for that in the IRA. But you can't deploy that as quickly as you can sort of more natural gas. So I think natural gas is going to be around for a while. You need more energy today. And the thing that I think gets lost in all of this is, well, what happens to economies in sometimes even entire countries that are dependent on natural gas exports? Is the expectation that they would just, if they can economically go pull those molecules out of the ground, which, for example, some of the gas fields in Qatar can produce at $1 a million BTU. That's really, really cheap energy. That they're just going to stop doing that? Or would they be paid not to do that? Because if they find one trading partner anywhere in the world, those molecules are getting pulled out of the ground and those emissions are being made. And so I kind of view this as not necessarily a bridge where, ultimately there's no natural gas usage or that it dwindles over time, but more of a way for those reserves of molecules to be monetized in a carbon constrained world.
Right.
Because if you say, hey, I've got a, $1 trillion worth of natural gas in the ground today, if the world cares about CO2 and my customer can't sequester it because they don't have the geology available to do it, a technology like ours is one of, if not the only way to continue that monetization. And so, we've actually got a member of the Qatari royal family on our advisory board who was instrumental in setting up some of the exports to Asia in the early 90s, Mohammed Al Thani. And so, we chat with them about that. And I think there's tremendous interest in deploying it once we get it to scale. I mean, it's not a part of the world where you develop a technology. It's a part of the world where you deploy the technology. So I think provided that there's a continued willingness to pay a premium to avoid making CO2, I wouldn't say it's a bridge technology. I'd say it's a monetization strategy for, huge sources of wealth for various geographies.
Right. It's a bridge to sustainability, perhaps, in the long term, like indefinitely. Yeah.
And if you can ameliorate the negative effects of extracting that resource, in my view, it's no different than, a cobalt mine somewhere.
Yeah.
Or extracting lithium from brine. All the energy transition vectors, ultimately, you need to extract something out of the ground in order to go build batteries or even to go fuel nukes. So I think we make natural gas feel similar from a climate change perspective.
When you think about that, just, the impact that you hope you could make on climate change, give us a sense of what the scale could look like if you guys were as big and impactful as you hope to be on the business side.
So one of the things that's unique about our approach to this is, we're a company that was founded by chemical engineers, or at least a chemical engineer and a biomedical engineer. But one of the rules of thumb is that bigger is better in chemical engineering. And so our view has been that you've got to be able to build a world scale hydrogen plant in a single process train. And that, containerized solutions, which a lot of VC firms love because, okay, they got it working in a shipping container. So it's TRL 9 in a shipping container. And now all we need to do is go build a factory, and we'll go build that shipping container that's making a couple 100 kilograms of something, and it's copy, paste, repeat, and it's all sort of deployment, and there's no scale up. That ultimately the economics of that are far too expensive. If you look at the chemical industry, aside from very sort of boutique, high margin products, there isn't really a model for, hey, how do you make commodity chemicals at small scale? You make them at massive scale. That's why, facilities run by BASF or like small cities, because you want to have big quantities of things, and then somebody's got a byproduct that's used in another process, and there's synergies for that. So we've got a process that in our process modeling that we've done with Technip Energies shows that we can build, something that's 100 KTA, 100 kilotons of hydrogen per year, which would be about 270 tons of hydrogen per day in a single process train. And that's about the scale that a world scale SMR, steam methane reformer, operates at today. And we're working through FEL studies right now with 3 paying customers. We're hoping to get 2 more by the end of the year, where the ultimate goal is to go hit FID sometime later this decade on building a world scale plant. And to put it in context of a power generation side, that 100 KTA hydrogen facility is about, call it 450 megawatts thermal energy. So that would get you partial decarbonization of a very large turbine that you might buy from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. I think their top of the line tops out at like 800 megawatts. So that would get you, 60%-ish, maybe a little bit better there. And, the electrical energy demands that we're talking about needing to have come online in the next decade are measured in the, hundreds of gigawatts globally. So there's a huge amount of demand out there, where something that we spend a lot of time as a small company. I mean, having 5 projects moving through front end loading for a small startup, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And so we're exploring partnerships with our investors and some prospective new investors for how we can have an even larger pipeline of projects moving, because in a CO2 constrained world, this is one of the only ways to decarbonize gas.
Yeah. I mean, you guys are obviously already the tip of the spear in terms of innovation. I'm curious, as you flip through science now, or reading other things, or talking to folks in your cap table or otherwise, are there other big innovations or fields of research in climate tech that you've got your eye on that you think are also interesting, that you're, aware of and excited about, that you think are also moving the needle in the right direction?
Yeah, I've always personally been a fan of, I'll call it fission rather than conventional nuclear, just to lump in the SMRs, different type of SMR, small modular reactor, not steam methane reformer. I think we should be building, conventional fission reactors as fast as we can. And so anybody that's got a more robust, lower cost way to go deploy conventional nuclear power, I think, is a great idea. Of things that are new out there, I mean, I think geothermal is very interesting. I'm not a geologist, but if there's a way to, reduce the uncertainty around the exploration there, that's exciting. I think geologic hydrogen could be interesting. Might even potentially be a market for us, because sometimes you've got pure hydrogen, but sometimes you've got other hydrocarbons that come up with it. And so, you can't just put those to flare, or that blows the carbon intensity score of your hydrogen. So that could actually be synergistic with us. And then, fusion is cool. I have no idea, at various breakthrough functions. I talk to some of the other fusion portfolio companies, and it's always very, very exciting. And I'm very curious. But, to be honest, when I was going through school, I could always understand what was happening as long as the atoms stayed together. But as soon as you started breaking them apart and getting into, subatomic particles, you kind of lost me. So I'm not really anything more than just a fanboy for the dream there. But I think those are all kind of interesting areas. But, conventional fission processes are probably a great bet.
Awesome. Last question. I hear all these ideas and have conversations with folks like you all the time. It reminds me that there's a lot of really smart, really passionate people who are out there across a wide swath of fields, innovating, putting a lot of energy into and a lot of capital into creating technology and the solutions that'll help, drive us towards a more sustainable future. And it keeps me hopeful about where we're going. I'm curious how you every day kind of stay optimistic and, the act of an entrepreneur, I think, is to be some days quixotic, some days hopeful, some days, pick the adjectives. How do you keep working towards positive solutions, towards a more sustainable future, despite or in light of some of the negativity that might be around us in any given moment?
Well, I think from a personal level, I think back to, having been on the investing side for a little bit. And you don't have all of the day-to-day challenges or, oh my gosh, the pilot is slipped in schedule. How are we going to address it? But you do have the ability to go impact it, being on the operations side. And I always like the fact that, yeah, we got a lot of challenges, but we can go address those at the hands-on level versus, being an investor, you're kind of like, well, we wrote these guys a check and we check in with them from now and then, but there isn't that much you can do to be helpful. So every time I wish that I had fewer sort of operational challenges, I think back to what it was like being on the other side, where you still had those challenges. You just didn't have to deal with them every day until until management brought them up to you.
Right.
And even then, you couldn't really do anything to affect them. So that kind of helps me think through it at sort of the operational level. At the macro level, I think we get a lot of comfort that we have to be right about this eventually, which doesn't mean that we can't run out of cash or go hit a scale-up gulf where we have to go put, $100 million into a first-of-a-kind commercial system and hit an air pocket from a funding perspective. That can pop up, and that's challenging. But I do think that, ultimately, we're going to have to be correct about natural gas playing a role in the future, and our process being hopefully the best way to go decarbonize natural gas at scale. And so that kind of gives me hope, because every time I zoom way out, it's like, our timing might not be right, but the vector that we're moving in has to be correct. And finally, I would say the team. We've got a really fantastic team that we've built at C0 and a lot of confidence that we can go work through the challenges that are going to pop up and go deliver on that mission. And so it's a lot of fun to work with such, hardworking, smart, dedicated people out working on the pilot in 104 degrees in Texas and, making sure that we can hit the milestones that we need to.
Yeah. Awesome. Where can folks learn more? Where do you want to send folks to hear more from you or read more on what's going on at C0? Where should they connect with you online?
C0.energy is an okay place to start. We're in the process of basically redoing our website. We haven't made a lot of changes in the last 3 years, and so there'll be more to learn there very soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today. Really insightful conversation, and can't wait to watch C0 continue in this space. It's good, really exciting technology. So thanks for taking the time today.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Connor. Appreciate it.
Huge thanks to Zach Jones for joining us on Consensus in Conversation this week. As Zach mentioned, you can find out more about C0 on their website, c0.energy. They've got a whole website redesign coming soon, so keep your eyes on that space. It sounds like a lot of cool stuff's on the way. We'll also have links to that and all their socials in the show notes, so you can go check it out. And also, head to the show notes on Spotify this week for the Q&A. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can also message me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at ckgaughan. Send us your questions, comments, ideas for future guests. We love getting your feedback. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful with growing our reach and adding new people to the conversation, and helps us continue to bring you more awesome talks with business leaders that you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted by me, Conor Gaughan, and executive produced by me and Jeff Rock. Our producer is Will Gatchell, with editing by the team at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker and Greg Harrigal on research. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.